Hello, I'm Dr. Manuel G. Saldivar. I'm a cognitive psychologist and a university faculty member. On this channel, I focus on ideas and concepts that will help you become more successful as a college student. Please join me for today's episode. Memory is the foundation of learning. All the things that we learn, we of course first have to remember. We have to recall information in order to be able to use that information to solve problems or just to live in the world around us. Everything that you pick up in college, all the knowledge you gain that will allow you to work in whatever your chosen profession is, as a nurse or engineer, as a medical doctor, as a scientist, as a business person, whatever your chosen career path. All that information has to be entered into your memory first so you can bring it back, you can recall it in order to be able to use it in your profession. In today's episode, I'm going to discuss how human memory works at a basic level. Now, this is a fairly technical subject, although I've tried to simplify it as much as possible. But don't despair if you find it confusing. You can always rewatch the video. But it's important to understand these basic steps that our brain goes through to create memories. Because if you're aware of how these steps work, then you can focus on the process in your own studying, in your own learning. This process by which the human mind creates memories is often called the information processing system. And it follows a cycle that looks like this. First, in order to create a memory, to remember something, we have to perceive that thing, that information, that event in the world around us. We have to pay attention. So I want to dwell on this point briefly because a common misunderstanding many students have, and this usually comes not because students don't care about learning or are not good students, but because someone has told them this in error, or you kind of pick up this perspective from the world around you even though it's not correct. Many students feel that if they just are kind of sitting quietly in the same room that someone is talking about some subject, that they'll be able to learn it, to remember it. And that's not really the case. Proximity to information, being adjacent to information, isn't really how you learn. You have to pay attention. You have to make an effort to focus on the thing that you're trying to remember, and in turn, by remembering stuff, that's how you're able to learn. So attention, focused attention, is the starting point of creating a memory and thus the starting point of learning. The information, the knowledge that you are observing or perceiving in the world around you goes into a part of our brain that is called short-term memory, sometimes also called working memory. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably for our discussion. Your working or short-term memory you can think of metaphorically as a tabletop or a desktop. If you're studying, if you're working on some project or some assignment, typically when you are sitting at your desk or at a table, you'll bring together all the stuff you need in order to do that work. So let's say your task is to study for a test. You may have a textbook in front of you. You may have pen and paper or a laptop to do notes, maybe to do research on the internet, to communicate with classmates by email or by sending some kind of direct message. The metaphor here is that the stuff you need to do a task, like studying for a test, is on the desktop, on the tabletop, all at the same time. This is how our short-term or working memory functions. It is the place where your mind is doing the work in order to let you process information at this moment. Some of that information is new and it's coming in from the world around you. You're perceiving it. You're paying attention to stuff. That attention could be a professor giving a lecture, could be a textbook that you're reading, could be a video that you're watching like this video. But this information goes into your working memory. From there, if it's new information, you're going through a process we call encoding. Encoding is a process by which you ascribe some kind of meaning or significance to the information that you are taking in, that you're perceiving. So if you're in a math class, you are not necessarily consciously sitting there thinking, this is a quadratic equation, it means blah, blah, blah. The process is typically much more automatic and much faster than this. But nonetheless, this encoding process is vital to creating a memory because it's where you give significance, or what I call in my teaching, a so what to a certain memory. Once this information is encoded, then it reaches your long-term memory. And again, metaphorically, you can think of your long-term memory as kind of a library. All the stuff you have ever learned that made it past short-term memory, that was encoded and makes it to long-term memory, is stored there. Your long-term memory is basically infinite for all intents and purposes. It stores all of your memories, all the stuff you've learned over your entire lifetime, not just to date, but your lifetime in the future, going forward. Of course, a lot of information you've learned in the past, you need to recall in order to be able to function day to day. And this process of recall brings information you've already learned into your short-term memory so you can solve problems. So again, let's go back to our analogy that you're sitting in a lecture and you're learning some new information about U.S. history, if it's a U.S. history class. You're paying attention, hopefully, to your professor, and you're learning some new things. You're getting new information. That information comes to your working memory. You're going to go through an encoding process that sends it to long-term memory. But of course, there's also information that you have already learned that you often need to recall to bring back into working memory in order to combine it or unite it with the new information so that it makes sense. For example, you may have learned previously in U.S. history that the U.S. federal government uses a system where the chief executive, the head of the federal government, is called the president. So that concept you may have learned many years ago when you were in K-12, in elementary school perhaps. Let's say you're in a college history class and you're learning about the history of a particular presidential administration. Let's say the administration of Abraham Lincoln, who was president during the U.S. Civil War in the 19th century. So your working memory is going to call in or recall information you've already learned, let's say about the concept of what it means to be president of the United States, maybe even the name or the face or other details about Abraham Lincoln. As you have getting new information in your college lecture, your working memory is the spot where all this information is being tied together so that you can create new memories that then go back to long-term memory and the cycle will repeat itself. Now, your working memory is finite. So I mentioned previously your long-term memory is essentially infinite. It's going to store memories for your entire lifespan. Generally speaking, scientists really have not found any limits per se to long-term memory. Your working memory is finite, however. It can only contain so much information. And forgetting typically happens at the working memory stage. So if you've ever had trouble recalling something, you can't remember the name of your fourth grade elementary school teacher, or you can't remember the formula for finding the area of a circle, even though you may recall or you may know that that information was in your mind at one point, what probably happened is that information never really made it to your long-term memory. You might have crammed it into your short-term memory for some amount of time, and then after perhaps taking a test or after somehow determining, even if this was subconscious, if it was not something that you consciously decided to do, your brain may have decided this information is no longer important, no longer useful, and so it just kind of goes poof and disappears. In other words, you never really learned that information in the first place, so you haven't forgotten it. It's just that that information never made it to your long-term memory. It was never encoded, and so, of course, you can't recall it. Now, there's a lot of detail I just went over. I encourage you to review this video if you want to go through these steps again. But this idea of short-term memory is very vital for you to understand as a college student, because this is where a lot of students get into trouble as learners. Cramming leads to short-term memorization, not to long-term learning. And the problem here is that you may think you're learning something, you may think you're preparing yourself for an exam, for example, but what you're really just doing is cramming information into your short-term memory. If you overwhelm your short-term memory because you are cramming, because you're trying to put a lot of information in short-term memory in a short amount of time, you're not able to encode properly. That information will never make it to long-term memory, and of course that means you won't be able to recall it. In some cases, and this happens a lot, I believe, at the high school level, where memorization tends to be a little easier to get away with, you have situations where you put information in short-term memory, and It will circle around in there long enough for you to take a test, write a paper. But then once that exam is over, once that quiz has taken place, then that information just goes poof. As a college professor, needless to say, I think all learning is important. But I understand sometimes students will put value on some learning versus others. Some students may feel, if I'm a business major, what do I really care about science? If I want to be a medical doctor, what do I really care about my fine art class? That's a debate I would like to have with students, because I think there are good answers to those questions. But let's put that aside and assume, okay, you are correct. If you want to be an accountant, who cares about your science class? I'm not saying that's the right attitude, but let's accept it just for the moment. It's one thing to cram for courses that are not central to your career. But if you're trying to use this cramming approach for courses, for information that is vital to your future, you're doing yourself a serious disservice, right? If you're trying to cram for in an accounting class and you want to be an accountant, you're putting yourself in a difficult position, because someday you're going to try and find a job as an accountant. Presumably, that's why you have that major, and you're going to compete against people who have actually learned accounting, who really understand what to do as an accountant. And so if you are just trying to get through life, get through your major by memorizing things, and you don't really understand what's happening, and even worse, once you take a test or take a quiz or whatever, that information goes poof, it's not in your head anymore, then when you take your next accounting class, you may struggle twice as much, because not only are you trying to learn new material in accounting to keep up with this metaphor or this example, but you've forgotten the information you needed as a foundation for the new accounting you're learning. And of course, this applies to math, science, history, any other subject. Sorry for the interruption, but if you're enjoying this video, please like, subscribe, and click on the bell icon for notifications. There's a real-world evidence of this that might illustrate this idea a little more clearly, so let me present this. This example I'm going to give you is fictional, but it's based on real research. So let's imagine that we have 3 students named Anna, Diego, and Lucy. And it turns out that all 3 students are in the same chemistry class, and they have an exam in a few days. And these 3 students take 3 different approaches. Anna has 4 hours to study based on her class schedule, her work schedule, her commitments with her family. She determines, however she does it, that she has 4 hours she can devote to study for this chemistry exam. So Anna's approach is to spend 1 4-hour block trying to cram all this information the night before the chemistry exam. Diego, as it turns out, with his class schedule, with his life and his commitments, also has 4 hours to devote to studying for this chemistry exam. But instead of 1 4-hour block, he divides his studying into 2 2-hour blocks a couple of nights apart. And then finally, Lucy, as it turns out, also has 4 hours that she can devote to prepare for this chemistry exam. But instead of 4 hours all at one go, like Anna, or 2 2-hour blocks of studying, like Diego, Lucy breaks her studying down into 4 1-hour blocks over different days. Statistically, from the research, students who break up their studying into just a small number of chunks, of blocks of time, tend to have poorer grades than students who are able to break up their studying into a lot of small blocks. There are technical reasons having to do with how our memory works, why this is the case. I'm not going to get into all the details in this video, but suffice to say, our brains react better to the process of creating memories. We're able to create memories more efficiently when we repeatedly expose ourselves to information over periods of time, as opposed to trying to cram everything all at once, especially at the last minute. So you want a concrete tip for helping yourself take advantage of how our brains actually work in order to become a better student, to become a better learner. You want to split up your studying into multiple sessions over time, as opposed to one big block of time crammed in at one go, especially if that one go is very short term, say the night before, the morning of, a need to recall that information, say in an exam. Another piece to this that's also important to understand in terms of how memory works, another area where students often get into trouble or have misunderstanding, is the idea, the assumption that our brain creates memories in the way that a camera takes photos or video. In other words, that if we can see something, we pay attention to something, that our brains are kind of automatically recording stuff in the way that a camera will record whatever it is that you're pointing it at. This is not the case. This is not the way that our brains work. Our brains, the human mind, does not work like a camera. It doesn't create recordings that have perfect fidelity. When I take a video with my camera, it doesn't care what I'm pointing at. It's just recording video. That's what a camera does. The human brain, however, doesn't create memories with perfect fidelity the way a camera takes a picture or a video. It's more like a painter. Every memory that the human mind creates is unique to us. It's subjective. This doesn't mean that multiple people, for example, in the same class, seeing the same thing or hearing the same information, of course their memories are going to be very similar if you're having the same experience, but they're not going to be identical. And the real takeaway here, the reason you want to focus on this idea that the human brain is more like a painter than a camera, is because you want to understand what approaches work best for your particular brain, your particular mind, your way of learning. There may be an approach to taking notes, for example. There may be an approach to reading that the person sitting next to you on one side of your college class uses that works perfectly for him or her. But if you tried it, you might struggle. Or it might work well for you. The person sitting on your other side, on your right-hand side in the class, may have a third approach to studying, to taking notes, to reading, or all the above. That works perfectly for her. But if you tried it, it may not work for you. Or it might work. You don't know until you try it. So there's no easy answers in order to become a good learner. You do have to be comfortable experimenting a little bit, trying different techniques, and finding the one that works best for you. But if you just assume that your mind works like a camera, that if I just sit in the class quietly and kind of point my eyeballs at the professor, somehow the knowledge will soak in, somehow I'll remember things, that's unlikely to happen. For one thing, if you're not focusing your attention, if you're not working hard to pay attention, for sure you're not going to perceive things anyway. But even if you do sort of sit there and just stare at the professor, that doesn't guarantee that you're really learning. At best, you may be memorizing some factoids. But again, especially if information you're trying to learn is key to your own career, you want to make sure you have a real understanding. Final point in terms of how our memory works is our memory is really like patterns. You see on the screen here, there are two different squares or rectangles that contain the exact same information. It happens to be the first several lines of the national anthem of the United States. But when it's just a chunk of text, it's just a chunk of text. It's a bunch of words that all kind of run together. But if we divide up these lines from the national anthem into lyrics, meaning that each line represents a particular line of lyrics, you can see that with very basic changes in spacing, punctuation, all of a sudden, the fact that the box on the lower right-hand side of the screen contains song lyrics seems much more obvious than the box on the top left of the screen. It's the exact same information. It's the exact same words. Technically, the grammar, the spelling, the capitalization is all pretty much identical. It's just some differences in spacing. But in this example, the point is these differences in spacing create a pattern, and our brain loves patterns. Our brain loves things that have a structure that seem to make sense, that we can use to predict what comes next. So even if you don't remember or don't know the other words to the national anthem, if I wrote them out in these 4-line chunks, then I'll bet it would be much easier for you to remember that information, to remember those words to the song, than if I gave you one big block of text akin to what's on the top left of the screen. Memories have meaning because we encode them with significance. That's kind of the takeaway from this whole lesson. This encoding process is vital to helping you transfer information from working memory to long-term memory. And so we give significance to information by telling ourselves, even if it's just on a subconscious level, what's the meaning, what can I take away, what is, as I say in my teaching, what's the so what to this information, why should I care about it, what kind of pattern does this information fall into, what kind of meaning can I ascribe to this information. If you take this approach as opposed to just trying to sit passively and let information wash over you, you'll find that it becomes much easier to learn, much easier to remember, because you are playing to the strengths of the human mind, as opposed to using an approach that doesn't really fit well with the way that the human brain works. If you ever studied the Pythagorean theorem in geometry class in high school, let's say, you probably remember this theorem, but most of us don't understand exactly what this means in real life because it's just a bunch of numbers and symbols all tied together. There's no meaning, so it's not really knowledge, it's just data, it's just information. It's not something we can apply because there's not necessarily a meaning associated with it. So to review this concept from today's episode of How We Remember Stuff, we talked about the concept that memory is the foundation of learning. Before we can use information, before we can be an accountant or a medical doctor or engineer, we need to learn the information that you need to do those jobs, to work in those professions. And so learning, of course, is a function of creating memories. This process is referred to as the information processing system. Cramming does not lead to long-term learning. You're just overwhelming your short-term memory, and so it makes it very difficult to recall that information over the long term. And the human memory doesn't really work like a camera. It's more like a painter. Memories we create are unique to us as we create them. They don't have perfect fidelity the way that a photo or a video taken by a camera has fidelity. Memories without any kind of meaning are just data. It's just stuff that we memorize, like the Pythagorean theorem. It's not really information that we can make any use of. Again, obviously this is a very technical area to think about, especially if you've never been exposed to these ideas about how human memory works. So don't get frustrated if it takes you a couple of views of this video, for example, to get a good grip on it. This is complicated information, but again, I think you'll find it very useful because as a college student, if you understand how your brain naturally works, you can learn to focus your studying, your learning, to take advantage of the way the brain naturally works as opposed to fighting against it, which really does not tend to lead to successful long-term learning. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll click on the thumbs up icon below. And if you really enjoyed it, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications by clicking on the bell icon. YouTube will notify you of future videos added to this channel. Remember, college success is challenging. It takes work and effort, but it is certainly within your grasp. Good luck.